Hello, hello. Welcome, welcome. It is awesome to see all of you here today. Uh, Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have a good session, and things are moving along quite nicely. Let's see here. Uh, uh, so next week, if you haven't heard, is our big intensive. This is our last intensive of 2023. This is uh, uh, the last time that we're going to do this particular intensive until the end of 2024. So if you are struggling to get Agile and UX to work together, if it feels like it's a constant battle, if you feel like you don't have a process that actually works for you, that every day you're just in a place where you feel like you're giving in to developers and product managers and not getting to do the things that you want to be doing, then I strongly suggest you join us next week for our Taking Control of Agile UX. We still have room for you in the sessions. The We're going to talk about all aspects of making Agile and UX work together. And in particular, we're going to focus on how we invert the idea that instead of trying to squeeze UX into agile size sprints, we're going to actually rejigger the whole thing to make agile part of a bigger UX initiative, which means that UX is actually going to help define parts of the agile process, like what the meaning of done is, so that your teams know what to ship based on what users actually need, because that's going to be fed in from research. It's going to create UX metrics for agile that are driving the agile process, so that the key metrics that your agile teams use, their KPIs, their OKRs, are actually based on UX metrics, not just on shipping things and trying to move arbitrary business numbers. We're going to talk about how we get the team's UX capabilities up to par, because Agile, when it's most effective, works best when you are in a situation that drives the whole process by having teams that have all the skills they need to do the work they're trying to do, and how we're going to use a vision of a better UX to truly inspire agile teams on what your users actually need. So if that all sounds good to you, if you'd like to work in an agile environment where UX is actually welcome and part of the process, and not only a welcome part of the process, but is actually driving the key decisions behind what the product is, how the product works, when you're going to ship it, all of those types of things, then you want to come to next week's intensive. It is 5 full days where we'll spend 90 minutes each day on together, and then you'll go off and start thinking about the way you're going to transform Agile in your organization. We've put together a transformation planning booklet that will come with the intensive, and that planning booklet will guide you through all the steps of how you make Agile work effectively uh, every every week, every day, every sprint, every epic, every release. We're going to go through all of that, how you restructure your agile process. So if this is something that you would like to take part in, this is something that you would like to see as part of your process, then you want to uh, um, make sure that you are delivering an an agile process, bring your scrum masters, bring your product managers. They too are going to need to know how this works, your dev leads, all those folks. And I bet you once you get them all talking about this, this is going to be the direction that they want to take where things are going. So we want to go in that direction. So please join us next week for our Taking Control of Agile UX intensive. I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the program, but this is where you want to start. Okay, but today we're going to talk about our user stories. We're going to dive into the crux of how user stories work and how they don't work, how they lead us to poor UX, and what we can do about it. It's a good lens into the process of how we make Agile work with UX together. And the way this is going to work is I've got a short presentation that we're going to start with. And then from there, we want to make sure that we are taking your questions into account. We'll give ourselves plenty of time for questions. So if you have a question, just put it into the chat. The way this is going to work is Monique is collecting up questions today, and we will collect them all up, and then we'll ask as many as we can. We'll go past the top of the hour to be able to answer as many questions as you have. So please, when you post your question, just put question for Jared in front of it. And if you don't mind, because we have a whole bunch of folks here, I see Monica and Nina and Nikki. If you can put in your first and last name, because we have more than 100 people in the room, it's not unusual. We have people with similar names, and that creates a little bit of confusion for Monique. So if you can make sure that your Zoom connection has your actual name, that will make things much, much easier for us. So please take care and make sure you do that. The easiest way to do that is to just move your mouse over the little box in the Zoom gallery that is you, and then click on the little meatball menu in the upper right, and then choose rename, and that will help out Monique quite a bit. Also, if you don't mind, when you submit your question, as we get closer to the Q&A, Monique's going to reach out to you, and she's going to ask you particularly about if you're ready to have your question answered. So look for her direct message and give her a ping back. If she doesn't hear from you, she's going to skip you and move on to someone else. Other than that, here's how this is going to work today. You want to feel free to open up the chat window if the chat pop-ups just get a little bit noisy. Also, please put your microphone on mute and keep it there for the duration of the process. That will be helpful to everybody. Speaker view is going to give you the most information here in terms of when I start to doodle and draw, because I always start to doodle and draw on things. This session is being transcribed by the robots. So feel free to open up the captions and see the words show up, and hopefully they actually match the words I'm saying. That does happen. It's not unusual, so we'll go from there. And we're going to post this recording as soon as we have it available, which will probably be tomorrow about this time. So look for that. It'll be in the Talk UX Strategy archives, and um, we can go from there. Um, we'll send you an email when it's ready, so don't worry about it. Okay, I think that's everything that I needed to tell you about. So let's see here. Um, what do we want to do? Oh, yeah, I'm going to talk about stuff. So let me do that. Okay. Just get things set here and we can get going. Fantastic. Okay, here we go. So, if you've ever worked in an agile process, you have probably found yourself in a situation where you have to either create user stories or work with user stories that somebody else has created on your behalf. And this is this is basically a given, right? The whole process of user stories is something that is in essence a fixture of Agile. It's been around since the beginning days that people started talking about Agile, and it's just stayed there ever since. And it works. I mean, you create these things, the team, it gives the illusion of working. Let's put it that way. It gives the team a way to figure out what they want to work on in a given sprint. They take the user stories. There's all sorts of rituals around them involving assigning them points or giving them size definitions or a variety of things. Uh, um, and so we want to basically uh, focus on um, looking at what those stories are doing. Because when we actually look at how the stories deliver us the products that we want to ship, it's not good news. They're actually breaking things up into little pieces that create a whole bunch of problems. So, what we want to do is focus our teams on practices that are really more effective, that actually lead to the outcomes that we want to get. And user stories are sort of at the core of this. We are getting mediocre to poor UX pushed out. We can see that. We can see that it's not the user experience we want. But what we don't realize is that the core of this problem are user stories. So we're going to sort of break up why user stories are the way they are. We'll talk through that. We'll talk about how they're hurting the user experience. Then we'll get into what we do about it. So let's talk about this. So when Agile was first conceived, it was actually the brainchild of a bunch of um, folks who had been doing sort of Agile style work for a long time, and in particular, Agile has its heredity from two sort of key processes, what's known as Scrum and what's known as XP. And these two basic practices, to sort of, you can call them frameworks or methodologies, whatever you want to call them, both the Scrum and XP frameworks, um, uh, they were uh, uh, created to sort of break massive, large projects down into little chunks. And for one of them, in particular XP, user stories were sort of like this key element. And they were proposed as this way to create lots of little to-do list items that the developers could check off one at a time. The person who first proposed them was one of the founders or inventors of the XP framework, a guy named Kent Beck. And if you read his early writings about user stories, what's interesting about them is that they were really sort of a QA process, right? The idea was to create little independent work units that could be built in any order and that could be tested independently so that you could tell whether they were working. And so the idea was to create these little testable units, and then you would you would assemble those units into the application that you were eventually building. And that was the whole idea. And if you read Kent's original essays on user stories and their advantages and how they work and why we use the as a, I want to, so that format. If you read all that, never once does he talk about the actual user experience. What he was doing with this was creating these very small chunks that were really just a way to break up a big, massive project into something that developers could just work on independently. And that's fascinating to me because they, even though they have the name user in them, they actually have nothing to do with users. And from a UX perspective, this is absolutely key. The this is really just um, a method by which we are able to just bring things into small chunks, which developers, there's a big advantage to doing it, but it's not a UX method. And because it's not a UX method, it actually has nothing to do with the users that we need. So this is a something that we have to realize. And we can sort of take apart why the evolution of user stories from 2001, when Kent Beck started promoting them, and then the adoption of agile processes and the adoption of user stories as the sort of atomic unit of these things, why they get us into trouble. So let's start by taking apart what we mean by a user story. So if you've seen them, if you've worked with them, you've run into them, they sort of fall into this pattern, which is they meet this syntax, which is as a user, right? Right, whatever that is, right? We'll substitute as a hiring manager, as a railway passenger, whatever that is. I want to, and then some objective. So that, and this is where we put some sort of result. And so this idea, as a user, I want to do this thing so that is sort of core to what we're talking about. So for example, as a hiring manager, I want to post a new job listing so that qualified job applications start coming our way. Or as a railway passenger, I want to price out first class options so I can decide if it's worth the money. Or as a recently laid off person, I want to apply for unemployment benefits so that I can get the money to pay this month's rent, right? And on the surface, all of these things feel fine, but they have some inherent constraints that cause us to build worse software than we should be building. and the experience that we get are less than ideal. Now, there are lots of folks who are intrigued by the practice of jobs to be done. Jobs to be done is has been gaining a lot of uh, inertia over the last few years. I'm not a big jobs to be done fan, but one of the things that is sometimes used in jobs to be done is something known as a job story. And the job story format is often promoted as a better way to establish these sort of user stories. So I know a lot of organizations have switched to these. Uh, there's a lot of discussion as to why it's a better format, but to me it's basically the same thing. But just so that we're complete, the idea is uh, it's the same sort of Mad Lib format where when some situation occurs, I want to again an objective with a so that result. So, as you can see, all we're really doing here is substituting the user persona for a situation. That's supposed to make it much, much better because jobs to be done, for some reason, thinks that personas aren't helpful. They're not helpful, but I don't think it's putting in a situation is that much better. Uh, uh, so it suffers from the same issues, and these issues are uh, are really interesting because when you sit back and you think about it, you realize, oh my gosh, these things are highly flawed. So the issues that we're often dealing with is, for example, the user story employs what I call false empathy, right? We say, well, as a user, I want to, and the key word here is I, right? And the problem with this is that, I don't know why sometimes I put crossbars on it and sometimes I don't, but we'll go with the crossbar I. The the problem with these I's is that we're putting the reader, who's usually a developer, into the position of the user, except the developer has had no exposure to the user and therefore doesn't really know what they need. As the teacher, I want to put together my lesson plans. They've probably never put together a lesson plan. So they're we're creating this notion of empathy. We're pretending that there's users here, but no users were actually consulted in the process of doing this. So this idea of using the word I is problematic. I mean, why not just say there are teachers who want to create a lesson plan and focus on that? And so this false empathy doesn't help us here. The other situation is that the objective is usually too small of a slice of the user experience. If we want to think about the life of a teacher, we can sort of say that there's a timeline, and on this timeline, a teacher does a bunch of things throughout their day, and one of those things is creating their lesson plan, and maybe that of all the things the teacher does, the lesson plan is a piece of it. But the fact is it's a very small slice of that user's day. And the more sort of hyper focused our objective is, the more we're dealing with this very small slice. Sometimes user stories describe something that only takes a few seconds out of the user's day. And from an experiential standpoint, that's not really a whole lot of experience to deal with. I understand that, back behind the scenes, there's a lot of code that goes into that small slice. But the problem is that we're dealing with just a little piece of a puzzle, not the whole thing. And that making that sort of breaking things down into tiny little pieces is problematic. What we're doing here, this Kent Beck's intent was to break all these things into little independent things. Well, imagine you have a 5,000 piece puzzle, but what you're doing is you're picking up a puzzle piece and you're actually drawing in the image one puzzle piece at a time in any order outside the context of the entire puzzle. What are the odds that single puzzle piece is going to, when it's placed in with the other matching pieces, is actually going to make a coherent image? It's really slim. And that's the problem of using way too small a slice, because if we have one slice here and then somebody else is working on one slice over here and somebody else is working on one slice over here, how do we get them to match up? And anyone who's ever tried to do any sort of real design in an agile environment has felt this pain of working on too small slices. And so that's a key problem that we're dealing with all the time is sort of this we're assembling the whole experience out of tiny independent slices, and that's not how experiences work. Which brings me to the next real issue that we run into, which is that user stories fail to deliver the bigger context of how this fits into the user's life. Imagine a developer who's got a backlog and they go and grab a user story off the backlog because it's got the right size to it for the amount of time they have to work on something. And they're reading this description, which is really the only specification for this thing that they get. And somehow they're supposed to figure out that this lives in a bigger context, that there's more to it. If a teacher is creating a plan for their, a lesson plan, that lesson plan comes from a bigger curriculum. It has to take into account the variations of the students that are in the room. It has to take into account how much the teacher knows about the subject matter. If you go and study teachers, you find out that sometimes people get assigned to a course that they've never taught before, and they're sort of learning the course a day ahead of when they teach it, because that's all the time they get to really get to the subject matter. And so now you've got this problem of not knowing the bigger context. And there are all sorts of things we can do to make that teacher's life better. But if we don't understand the context, we stay very focused. And that's problematic. And then the other key pieces of this is that the user stories are almost always very transactional, right? Creating a lesson plan has a defined start, middle, and end. And so there's a thing that gets done. And a subset of the user experience of products and services is just that. There's a start, middle, and end. I want to post a message in a social media platform. I want to look up information about stage 4 pancreatic cancer, right? There's a start, middle, and an end to that. But that's not necessarily the experience that the user is having. The user is involved in a conversation where there isn't necessarily a start, finish, or an end. The user is involved in trying to figure out how to be a caregiver to a loved one who's just been diagnosed with cancer. That is a much bigger thing. And so this notion of still having a start, finish, and an end is problematic. Now, sometimes people try to fix this with epics, but same problem. Epics still need a start, finish, and end. They're just trying to do it on a slightly bigger scale. So the problem with user stories is that they don't lend themselves to things that are just not a transactional element of life. And much of life is not transactional. And so that's a problem. I'll give you an example. You're sitting here listening to me. Now, we can treat the transaction as I'm saying words and you're hearing them, and maybe you're taking notes in a notebook. But how you then apply what you're learning into the rest of your life, there's no start, middle, and end to that. And so this makes this problematic. So transactional work is only a small portion of what real experiences are all about. And we keep trying to reduce things down to basic transactions, but that eliminates a large portion of the actual experience that people have, which is why it always feels like products don't help us actually do the things we're trying to do. Another piece of this is the fact that very rarely do I find that any user story creation process is seeped in actual research, that there are problems with this idea that we don't use research as we're creating our creation process, right? We don't, people who are creating these things, even when they're UX designers, have rarely actually been exposed to the users who are going to use the things we're building. They don't know what the contexts are. They don't understand the bigger picture, and they really don't know much about the lives of the users that are there. So this process is problematic because we don't have research. Similarly, it's also very reactive. By reactive, what I mean is that we start the user story process by already having defined a function or capability. We're adding a lesson plan editor. So we're going to build out a lesson plan editor, so we better figure out what the user stories are for the lesson plan editor. What we're not doing is understanding what the experience is of teaching a class in a situation like you don't really know the subject matter. You've been asked to substitute in for another teacher who had to go on leave, and now you're covering for them. How do you actually make this happen? So this is the problem, right? Being reactive to the functionality means the functionality comes first. It doesn't mean that the need that the user has comes first. There are a few more things that, I mean, this is quite enough, but there's 6 of these already, but there's 3 more that I've uncovered, which is user stories almost always just deal with the happy path. Because people's lives are really complex, they rarely ever go down the path we expect them to go down. They have all sorts of exceptions and complications that happen in the process. But when we create the user story, we only really ever talk about the process of that start, middle, and end as if it's all going perfectly. And that creates issues when it doesn't go perfectly because our systems are unprepared to handle that. And they also only deal with the context of the average user. When we say, as a teacher, I want to create a lesson plan, what we're actually saying is, as an average teacher, as we imagine an average teacher to be, I want to create an average lesson plan. It doesn't take into account, I want to make sure I have a lesson plan because I have a class that has several special needs students in it. So how do I take care of that? Or I want to create a lesson plan where I'm co-teaching this material with someone else, or I want to create a lesson plan where half of my students do not have full understanding of the language that I'm teaching in because it's a second language to them. And so the practice of um, uh, making sure that the average user is doing the average work, we get ourselves into this practice of not paying attention to what's happening at the margins. And because we're not focusing on the people at the margins, we typically run into software that doesn't meet anyone's needs because there is no such thing as an average user or an average task. And finally, we don't ever talk about how completing the objective actually improves someone's life. There is no understanding of what the life is like today, what the current experience is there. We just say, I want to create a lesson plan so that I can stand in front of the room and not, and communicate the key points of the class. That actually doesn't tell me how doing a good job will actually make someone's life better. So these are the things that get us into trouble from user stories. And we don't talk about these. I don't see any discussion of this, even though they are inherent in the way that we work. We just take the user stories for granted. They have to be there. We either are the ones who create them or somebody else is spewing them out and we're working with them, but they don't give us the benefit of actually working on better experiences. So the process here is that we get ourselves into real trouble by this. So instead, let's talk about what we can do differently. The first place is to start with outcomes. Now we can think of the world as outputs and outcomes. Outputs are what we deliver into the world. They're the things that we give to the world. But outcomes are the change in the world that happen because we've done a good job. We can say that design is the rendering of intent. The change in the world is our intent. And what we want to do is express that change. We want to make sure that we're expressing what it is that change in the world. And we'll deliver something, that's the rendering, but we need to understand where that is, right? What we're trying to do. So when we think of a user story, we say, this format of the user story, we focus on, as a user, I want to do a thing so that a result happens. What we want to ask the question is, if we do a great job on this thing, how does that improve someone's life? We want to bring that user into the process by talking about what we're working on and the rendering or the intention that we're going to get. And that's usually more than just this simple idea of I want to create a class, right? The teacher is trying to get students to have better understanding of the material that is happening. That's the change that the teacher is trying to do, right? So if we go back to the person who's applying for unemployment benefits, right? If we're working on a system that is all about applying for unemployment, if we do a great job on that system, how does that improve someone's life? We want to answer that question, right? They'll be able to quickly and confidently enter their data, promptly receive eligibility requirements, and get benefits in their bank account right away. How do we know this is an improvement? Because we've studied through research the experience of people applying for unemployment benefits. And what we see today is that those unemployment benefits, when they apply, they feel like they're always making mistakes, and there's things all over the system that say if you enter false data, we will arrest you and put you in jail because fraud is a crime. So they're really anxious about making mistakes, but they don't understand the questions and they don't understand if they're putting in the right answers. And then they wait to find out whether they were eligible for this, and they get no response from the system. And then they can't tell if they're going to get the money that they desperately need to pay their rent in order to on time. They have no sense as to whether that shows up until it shows up in their bank account. So it could be a day, a week, a month. They don't know, right? So we do the research, we discover those problems, and now we have a clear understanding as to where the experience is that needs improvement. And we can base this specifically on those people applying for benefits. And we are not done until we have that outcome. So one way to think about this is most teams, when they're starting with user stories, they immediately focus on the solution, right? We're building a lesson plan software. We're building a unemployment benefit application system. So that's the solution. And we hang our user stories off of this. But the thing about this solution is that we should be making sure that people understand that it's not done until we can talk about the improvements that happen in people's lives. So that's the UX outcome, right? That's how are we getting improvements into the lives of our users. So that's the definition of done that we need to be using here, is this idea that we're making an improvement. But how does the developer know that that's the definition of done? To go back to Kent Beck's original premise that user stories are here to help us test, how do we know that that's done if we don't have a way of communicating that? So we need to start there. And then the next piece of this is that that outcome comes from the current experience. We go into the current experience of the user. We study what it's like to be a teacher preparing a lesson plan. We study what it's like to be someone applying for unemployment benefits. And we get the full picture of what that experience is like today. And we use that experience to ask the question, if we could make that experience better, how would it improve the life of the teacher? How would it improve the life of the unemployed person? And those become our outcomes. So now we've connected these outcomes to the current experience. Well, that current experience, right, is based on that timeline. And that timeline can be measured in terms of extreme frustration to extreme success, extreme delight, right? So we can meet someone who's a teacher. Let's call her Edna, because if you hang out with me, you know, I always call the person Edna. It's a real teacher. This is not a persona. This is not an imaginary person. This is not me pretending to be a teacher. This is a real teacher, but Edna has delightful moments in preparing and frustrating moments in preparing. And I can go through and I can look and I can see, oh, when she's preparing her lesson plan, if she doesn't know the material, she doesn't know what to put into her lesson plan. Maybe we can help her with that. Or if she's working with students whose English is a second language, we can possibly help her with that. So there's all sorts of places where she finds it frustrating, and we can ask the question, well, what would it look like if it was a great experience all the way across? And suddenly this becomes the key to our outcome, right? And we can ask the question, well, how do we raise up Edna's experience? To do this, we have to know both Edna's current experience and what the improvement to our life is. That makes it easier for us to understand what it is we're trying to build. And so now we can focus on that. And the elements of this allow us to really understand what's going on. But there's one more question that we have to answer here. And that question is about the why can't Edna just get the lesson plan she wants without our help? And the answer to that question is there are problems that Edna has that we have to solve for her. We have to solve the problem of her not having the requisite material to be able to teach a subject she's not 100% familiar with. We have to understand what it means to teach a class that has many students who don't speak English as her native language. And so we can come up with solutions for these, but we have to understand the problems. And then we can use that to get the solutions. We then iterate through our agile process like we would with this. And if the solution gets the improvement to Edna's life, bingo, we did a great job. But if the solution doesn't get that improvement, that's where we struggle. So now we have a better understanding of the problem. And so what's missing from the user stories as they exist today is we are not talking about, whoops, I bumped my camera, sorry about that. We are not talking about the experience that, the outcome that we want Edna to have, and we're not talking about her current experience and the problems to solve. And this is what we need to focus on. Now, the way we get there is through experiential research. Experiential research has us go out and map out, in this case, Edna's journey in putting together the planning document, but it's also looking at what she does before that, what she does between the time she plans the lesson and she delivers it, what she does after that. We're looking at the full experience all the way across. And as a result, what we're doing when we're looking at that full experience is we are growing our team into becoming experts. And that's the key here. Because part of the problem of why we're using these user stories is that we want our developers to be able to make smart decisions, but they can't make smart decisions if they don't have the requisite background experience. So part of our job from UX is to augment that experience to the point where we are actually delivering something better over time. So I want to go back real quick to this idea that there's a there's there's a puzzle piece, and the typical way that we create user stories is we just basically are drawing what needs to be on that puzzle piece, and we put it on a pile, and we draw the next puzzle piece, and we put it on the pile, and we draw the next puzzle piece, and we put it on the pile. But that's not how puzzles are made. How puzzles are made is you draw the whole image, the finished image, and then you cut up the pieces. And if we want the developers to be working on little small bite-sized pieces, that's fine. But we have to start with the whole image. And that's where scenarios come in, right? We have to have the big picture. And we can use techniques like Jeff Patton's story mapping, which is a technique for taking a scenario. What is Edna's full day like? What is Edna's week like? What is Edna's life like? And then breaking that into small pieces, or into Young's mental model mapping, another great technique where we're looking at the functionality and we're looking at what Edna's trying to do, and we're seeing where there are gaps. And we're focusing on the big picture, and we start there. But we can't stop there, because what we need to do is we need to make sure that the developers themselves, the people who we're asking to work on these pieces, that they understand the current experience, that they understand the problems we're trying to solve, that they understand the outcome. This cannot be delegated down to a small little puzzle piece. We need to have this as the bigger picture. And this is what we need to focus on. This is why Agile is very hard to just plug, it's very hard to just plug UX into Agile and say, well, we're just going to do UX on little puzzle piece size things and not focus on the big picture. And when we do UX on just these little puzzle piece size things, we come up with a disjointed, poor experience. And that's the problem that we have. We are always focusing on too small an experience. We are never, ever looking at the whole thing, at what it means to really be developing the bigger picture. And because there will never be enough designers and enough researchers for all the developers out there, they have to know that bigger picture too. The best thing we can be doing is by extracting UX out of the Agile process and working on it far more holistically, and then taking what we learn and delivering that back into the Agile process. And therefore, the developers can cut up the puzzle pieces all they want, as long as they have that full image. They can work on the whole thing. And that's the process. Now, there's a lot of moving pieces to this. There's a ton of that. And we can get into that in the Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to put them into the chat, and we can answer them. But this is what we're going to spend next week talking about. This is the key to what we're going to spend in our Taking Control of Agile UX intensive. Because in order to back out, in order to understand how we're going to get a current experience and problems to solve that our developers are the world's foremost experts in, and why shouldn't our developers and our product people and our key stakeholders, why shouldn't any of them understand what, what it is our users are trying to do? Why aren't they the foremost experts in our users? If we really want to deliver great products to them, they need to be the foremost experts. So they need to have this solid understanding of how this happens, right? And at the same time, they need to know what the outcomes that we're shooting for are. So we need all of these things to happen here. So we want to make sure that we have all of these pieces together. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. I'm going to break it down for you and walk through the whole process of how you build an Agile UX practice that takes UX out of sprint mode and puts it at the top, where we're thinking about the whole vision of what the product should be. That's the image that we're drawing of the puzzle pieces, right? Where we're talking about how to then break that up into releases and epics and down to sprints. And then we're making sure that the developers have everything they need and the product people have everything they need to make sure that that product gets built to be great UX, not poor UX, not mediocre UX. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. So if you are interested in that, I want you to go check out the page that describes the whole program and go make sure you've signed up, because this is happening starting next Monday. We're going to have 90-minute sessions that happen 2 times a day. So if you can't make the early one that happens at noon Eastern time, there's another one that happens at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to record the whole session. We're going to make this be a big part of the practice. So if you want to understand all of this, you want to work with the transformation guide, go to agile.centercenter.com and check out the whole program. Bring your Scrum Master, bring your product manager, your development leads. Let's get this thing happening, because this is how you're going to really jumpstart your organization and really start to do the work that you are capable of doing, but the practice is holding you back. Now, the next time we meet, go make some awesomeness. Take care. Jared here. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing so you'll get more videos like this. If you have any comments, questions, or thoughts, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And hey, consider joining our Leaders of Awesomeness community. It's completely free, home to over 50,000 UX leaders who regularly share questions, ideas, inspiration about their experiences. The link is in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.